We now turn to our first specific subject under equality, looking at gender equality, broadly construed. Our reading for this section is from Mary Wollstonecraft. A bit of background for her. She was born April 27th, 1759, died September 10th, 1797. She was born in Britain, and she ended up marrying the philosopher William Godwin. Godwin was an atheist and a leader in the anarchist movement, and anarchism is a philosophical, political view in which there should be no government. Now, it's not the view that there should be no order, society, or organization. Rather, it's a view that there should not be a government or state. And anarchists typically present this in terms of getting rid of an oppressive state. And they have various arguments in favor of that, but that would take us way off subject. Her daughter, Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter, was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, better known as Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. In terms of her sort of general background, she was a feminist. Now, feminism is a complicated notion, and there are many different versions of it, and not surprisingly, in politics and debates, people often present straw person versions of feminism, or just simply lie, to simply make up things to attack the notion. But there's a wide range of feminist theories and feminist views. It's often broken up into the various waves of feminism based on the time periods, and you can also divide it up based on the particular viewpoints. And again, in politics, what people often do is straw person it and just take some sort of distorted extreme version and attack that, and then claim to refute all feminism. But of course, that's fallacious reasoning. One of her core views was that what people took to be the nature of woman, what women naturally are, was actually the result of education imposed by men. Now, this general subject is rather important and interesting, which is the question we looked at a bit in moral education, which is the question of what are people by nature. And this is asking a similar question, in terms of people's, gender broadly construed. How much of it is nature that we're born with? How much is something that's imposed by society? How much do we choose? And again, in politics and many debates, people simply just assume they know the answer without any research, and often engage in straw person attacks on distorted views of their opponents. But there's a very interesting question here about what are people by nature, if anything. Wollstonecraft also argued that marriage was a form of legal prostitution, and yes, she was married. And she argued in favor for equality and for a rational social order devoid of superstition and prejudice. She was quite a prolific writer. Now, during the time period when she was writing, really long titles were quite popular. People like Descartes, writing in the 1600s, had rather long book titles, and it seemed to be like a thing people just kind of did. Not surprisingly, when people, like in academics or in general, reference books, famous books with really long titles, they often shorten them down to like a few key phrases, otherwise it just goes on. So her works include in 1787, and this is the title of the book, Thoughts on Education of Daughters, with reflections on female conduct and the more important duties of life. In 1790, there is A Vindication of the Rights of Men, and her letter to the Right Honorable Edmund Burke, occasioned by his reflections on the Revolution in France. In 1792, probably one of her most famous works, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, with strictures on political and moral subjects. In 1794, an historical and moral view of the origin and progress of the French Revolution and the effect it has produced in Europe. In 1796, letters written during a short residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And then in 1798, Maria, or the Wrongs of Woman. And those are her publications. Now, in terms of the content of the excerpt we're reading for the class, she is beginning by looking at the question of wealth. As I noted before with virtue theorists, they are rather concerned with the ethics of wealth. And if you're going to put Mary Wollstonecraft into sort of a general moral theory category, she quite directly presents herself as a virtue theorist, making reference to virtue, etc. And so not surprisingly, she does engage with the question of wealth, which is an important issue when it comes to equality, because there is, of course, wealth inequality, and then there's the inequality that stems from being in particular groups that generally don't get the same access to wealth that other groups get. So let's begin to see her view of wealth. So she contends that evil flows from the respect paid to property. So what sort of evils arise? Well, she looks at wealth as having an impeding effect, because if people respect, property too much, and she's not talking about like respecting property like not breaking people's windows, but having sort of too much respect for property, seeing it as central and too important. And she believes that this kind of focus on property blocks or interferes with good dispositions a person might have to developing into virtue. And she notes, quite correctly from a factual standpoint, that classes compete to gain respect through property. I mean, she's writing the 1700s, but this is still true today. In countries like the United States, much of the respect a person gets is based on the property they acquire and possess, be this, money or, wealth, corporation, stocks, bonds, owning companies, etc. And she thinks this is a mistake because, again, she seems to be a virtue theorist, and she believes that property, possessions, wealth, etc., is getting the respect that should be due to talents and virtue. That what our society should respect is not how much property a person has, but their talents and whether they're a good person or not. One of her major concerns is with hereditary wealth, and that's wealth one earns by inheriting it, of course, by having one's parents or other somebody else die and bequeath to you wealth, property, etc. Now, not surprisingly, virtue theorists and ethicists are often very concerned about hereditary wealth. In the United States, it is, of course, well protected. There are recent changes to the laws, making, basically reducing the taxes people have to pay on it. And it's, in the United States, it's very strongly protected. Wollstonecraft, of course, considers this, not talking about the United States, because, she's not talking about the United States now, because she's writing the 1700s, but she believed that hereditary wealth and titles had a negative impact. Now, she's writing from the standpoint of someone in Britain, which, of course, they have then and still have today, nobility, a king, etc. When Wollstonecraft was writing it, of course, the monarchy was considerably more powerful than it is today, but this point could still be applied even, outside of the 1700s. And her concern is that if someone simply gets wealth and inheritance, and titles, they become idle. And basically she believes that the only way we develop our faculties, and this is similar to what we saw with Aristotle's virtue theory, is by exercising them. And she contends that people won't do this typically without motivation. And the motivation is necessity. That if people simply inherit, wealth, they're, well, roughly put, they're not going to be well motivated. And this creates kind of an interesting view. Now, there are broader moral issues here in terms of, questions about the ethics of wealth, the ethics of hereditary wealth especially. But again, we'll try to I'll try to stay focused on our main concern, which is the notion of equality. So, according to her, how does one acquire these virtues? And much like Aristotle and other virtue theorists like Confucius, she believes one acquires these virtues by discharging duties, by doing what one is obligated to do. And she's critical of people who have lost their humanity through the flattery of sycophants. Basically, if someone's, upper class, especially like holding a title, then she thinks they'll be, corrupted by this flattery. Now, what about equality? She contends that in order for morality to gain ground, to advance, then what is needed is more equality. That this is essential for ethics. Why not? Or why so? Well, she thinks that virtuous equality will not be established if half of mankind is continually undermining virtue through ignorance or pride. So, one impediment to virtue is going to be inequality. And part of this inequality is dependence. Because if someone's in a state of, lacking equality, they will have less and they'll need to depend on others. And she regards dependence as an impediment to virtue. So, what does she mean? What she claims is this. Virtue cannot be expected from women until they have some degree of independence from men. And again, keep in mind she's writing in the 1700s, but it's well worth considering when going through Wollstonecraft what has changed, if anything, from the time period she was writing. So, why do women need to be independent from men? Well, her contention is this, that mere natural affection cannot make them good wives and mothers, and she claims, and this may seem somewhat insulting, that if a woman is dependent on their husband, they will become, they'll have vices. Specifically, they'll be cunning, mean, and selfish. Now, of course, this can be debated, but she sees this dependence as harmful to women. Now, her solution, as we'll see, is not that women should be abandoned, and left entirely on their own. Her view is that women should be given and allowed the opportunities to be independent, to succeed. So she considers some additional impediments to virtue. What's kind of interesting is, these are things we often see as positive. The first one being wealth. And typically if someone said, hey, would you like some wealth? Most people would say, why, yes, I would definitely like some wealth. Also, charm, being charming. We generally would see that as a good quality. If we say, oh, that person is charming, we wouldn't think of them as that being an insult. And lastly, of course, hereditary property, which is property you're just given because somebody dies and gives it to you. Obviously totally unearned. And although obviously it would be sad if you cared about the person and they died, getting property for nothing, for no effort, seems like a pretty sweet deal. So why does she see these things as bad? Well, she claims that wealth enervates, basically robs the energy from people. And in the case of men, she thinks that wealth takes away their energy. And in the case of women, again, during the time period she's writing in, because women during that time generally, couldn't have jobs and so forth, that they had to live by their charms. And she believes that when people are doing that, being enervated by wealth and living by their charms, they cannot engage in the duties that require exertion and self-denial that would make them virtuous. So basically, focusing on wealth and charm, a charm would be like beauty and, appealing to people, etc. Now, what about hereditary property? Well, she claims that it does sophisticate the mind, but I guess that could be debated as well, but tends to impede the use of body or mind. So her claim is that hereditary property weakens people. Interestingly, jumping ahead to the United States of today, we often hear arguments from conservatives that if people get, things like student loans or food stamps or, other forms of assistance, that they'll become, weak and impeded. Interestingly, though, the same conservatives tend to be very protective and defensive about hereditary property. But logically, it would seem to have the same effect. If it is true that hereditary property is harmful to people, then one can infer that maybe being dependent could be harmful as well. But likewise, the reverse would seem to hold. If, as the conservatives argue, getting support and so forth would be harmful to a person, then Wollstonecraft would seem to be right, that hereditary property, because it's getting property for nothing, essentially not earning it or deserving it, would be harmful as well. And that is another interesting moral debate. Is getting, say, stuff that one does not work for or allegedly not earn, does that have a corrupting effect? And Wollstonecraft definitely believes, yes, it definitely, in the case of hereditary stuff, definitely does. And she's quite negative about this hereditary property. She also believes that the society of her time was not properly organized because it did not compel both men and women to discharge their duties. Again, virtue theorist. So, being a virtue theorist, as we saw with Confucius and Aristotle, typically one of their main selling points for the theory is happiness. That if you're virtuous, you'll become happy, and that's the objective. Now, she believes that when people pay too much respect to wealth and personal charms, again, beauty and the ability to be charismatic, etc., she thinks this blights both affection and virtue. And she is critical of women focusing solely on beauty. She doesn't seem to be anti-beauty, although there are some feminists who do take that view. She does not seem to be anti-beauty. Her concern appears to be that if a woman is focusing primarily on her beauty and neglects her other duties, she's sinning against herself because she's not making herself useful and she's not making herself happy, at least according to Wollstonecraft. So, what is true happiness for her? Well, she's a virtue theorist, so not surprisingly, true happiness involves virtue. Virtue is satisfaction, which arises from well-regulated affections, and for her, affection includes a duty. So, embracing very much classic virtue theory. She then turns to the slavery of women. Now, one interesting question when it comes to inequality, specifically those involving oppression and mistreatment, which they so often do, there is the question of the people engaged in the inequality, the people engaged in, say, oppression. Are they aware of what they're doing? Is this a conscious decision on their part? Now, the answer, of course, varies from context to context and would, of course, vary from person to person. Now, there are those who do contend that men, not every man, of course, but some men, are consciously aware of what they're doing and are creating a system, often referred to as the patriarchy. Now, Wollstonecraft takes the view that, in general, men are unaware of the misery they cause and the vicious weakness they cherish by only encouraging women to be pleasing rather than being fully developed as people. And so she is taking the view that this is not a conscious activity on the part of men to, do this to women. Now, of course, she's aware that, a man, of course, can be aware that they're harming, a particular woman or doing bad things. But her view is that men, in a sense, are unaware of what they're doing. And as we'll see, later in this excerpt, that she believes that men are being harmed by this as well. It's a thing that's bad for everybody. And she also asserts that men, without realizing it, are making natural and artificial duties clash by sacrificing the comfort and respectability of a woman's life to the notions of beauty. And going back to the question of nature, Wollstonecraft claims that in nature, comfort, respectability, and beauty harmonize. Now, she also turns to the questions of distinctions of rank, and she holds that women are held, at least the time period she's writing, but again, this is one reason why I selected this writing, in addition to it being public domain and hence free, is also provides a context to compare, the past with the present. And she claims that there are these distinctions, these chains that lock women effectively into slavery and ignorance. And these include the distinctions of rank. Now, she was married to an anarchist, and anarchists, of course, are very much on getting rid of the oppressive state. Again, they don't oppose society and order and so forth, but they oppose the state as a system of oppression. And so Wollstonecraft contends that distinctions of rank make civilization a curse. How so? Well, they divide the world between tyrants and their cunning and envious dependents, which is a pretty negative view of the people who are, in a way, victims of tyrants. But it essentially is saying it's terrible for everybody, because these distinctions corrupt every class. Why? Well, because her view is that respectability is not gained by being virtuous, but to the station, to one's rank. Like in the United Kingdom, they literally have ranks of nobility. And then, of course, countries that don't do, although they don't explicitly have like titles and ranks and so forth, we do clearly have distinctions. We do call them things like millionaires and billionaires, the wealthy and the poor. And so she contends that when duties are not fulfilled, the affections are then too weak to fortify virtue. So it's pretty bad for men on her view, because, again, when it comes to questions about inequality and gender, etc., broadly speaking, some oversimplifying things as well, there is the question of, who is being harmed, and Wollstonecraft's view is that everyone is being harmed by this. But women are being more harmed, because these distinctions of rank, which he criticizes, do hurt everybody. But she believes that, at least in the case of men, they do have a chance to, slip free and be able to think and act for themselves. But for women, because the condition of women in the society Wollstonecraft is discussing is, it'd be an incredible, difficult, or a Herculean task, as she says, referencing Hercules, his famous labors. And so she sees these distinctions in rank as something that is bad. Now, wealth. Now, virtue theorists typically have a complex relationship with the concept of wealth. On one hand, they tend to be very critical of it when it is impeding virtue, but they tend to be accepting of it when it's not. And Wollstonecraft takes a similar view. So she believes both women and men are made weak by wealth, because it makes things too easy. And she believes that women have it even worse, because, as she says, they're made slaves to their persons. It must be alluring, so men will guide them with their reason. So, again, she's writing the 1700s, but she's contending that what women have to do essentially is win over a man, to focus on their appearance and beauty and look and so forth to get a man, because without a man, they really can get nothing. They can't have jobs, etc. So what if a woman's ambitious? Well, Wollstonecraft does take a fairly negative view, that an ambitious woman must govern their tyrants by sinister tricks. Why? Well, because, as Wollstonecraft, during the time period she's looking at, women were generally seen as lacking rights, and if someone has no rights, she contends, they cannot have any duties, or so she claims. Next, the laws. Now, when Wollstonecraft was writing, of course, the laws governing, marriage are obviously rather different than they were today. This can be seen as a form of traditional marriage, of a certain kind, of course. If throughout history there's different versions of traditional marriage, if you define it as being marriage like in the past. So her criticism is that the laws of her time made women essentially just subsumed by the man. It was the man, when they got married, the woman in a way kind of effectively vanished legally, and they were in effect, the man's property. And so the woman was effectively, eliminated. So what about today? So an interesting thing to consider would be the laws that govern marriage today, and of course, the laws that govern divorce. They've obviously changed quite a bit from Wollstonecraft's time, and even relatively recently, in terms of how divorce works. Although states vary, currently there's a common thing is like a no-fault divorce, and it's typically like a 50-50 split. And in the case of marriage, the laws have changed, and some relatively recently. In fact, if you look into it, it can be somewhat shocking to see how recently some laws have changed in between, how typically how a husband can treat their wife. And women in not so distant past, fairly recent past, generally had far fewer rights in marriage, and the man generally had the upper hand, legally speaking. Now, of course, depending on your view of how marriage should work, this could be seen as good or bad. But Wollstonecraft clearly thinks that this would be a bad thing to simply make the man dominant in marriage.